In this lesson, we're going to look at why biodiversity is important and how humans are affecting it. As a review, remember that organisms depend on each other through food, symbiotic relationships, and that there are these selective pressures that act on natural variations, and they result in natural selection that selects the most adapted individuals to survive and reproduce. So that basics of evolution. Now we're going to talk about why biodiversity is important within populations and within ecosystems. So the first thing is just when we talk about biodiversity, what we're talking about is differences in individuals or differences in populations. So why are differences in individuals important to a population? Well, as we talked about before, if there's no differences between individual organisms, so that there's no variation, then natural selection can't happen and you can't adapt. And all ecosystems undergo some types of change at some point, and organisms are going to need to adapt. So for example, going from this forest to this Serengeti, that was the selective pressure that resulted in human beings walking. It also helps prevent the spread of disease. So regardless of what the disease is, so for example, the Black Plague, somebody out there or a number of people out there are going to be resistant to it. And so a disease generally won't wipe everyone out. Same goes for things like pesticides and antibiotics and vaccines. And then it just maintains overall population health. This is where we're talking about we need more variation because otherwise we get inbreeding and we get various issues, especially the matching up of recessive traits. And you can see this kind of thing in purebred dogs, for example, that have a lot of issues with things like hip dysplasia, which is a recessive trait. And so having more diversity helps prevent these kinds of recessive diseases. Now, as far as ecosystems are concerned, we're talking about the diversity of different species. So we want there to be a lot of different species in an ecosystem. And that's mostly because, remember, we talked about how ecosystems are in balance. And the more organisms you have, or the more different species you have, the more stable you are, because if one species happens to go extinct, it's not going to destroy the entire ecosystem. It's kind of like if you have a stool that has 3 legs. If you remove one leg, you're going to fall over. But if you have a stool with 20 legs, one leg doesn't make as much of a difference. Another example of that is if everything was in a food chain, let's say the frog went extinct for some reason. Well, that means that the snake and the hawk are also going to go extinct because they're directly reliant on that frog. In a food web in which we have more diversity of species that are more interdependent, now the loss of one of these individuals' species is not going to necessarily destroy the whole ecosystem. And additionally, ecosystems need to be able to adapt and change, and so the more species you have that can adapt and change into new niches and things like that, the better off the ecosystem is as a whole. So now let's look at how humans are reducing this biodiversity. And this is a big deal in ecosystems all over the world. So for one thing, we're polluting most places. We're altering ecosystems, so we're changing them. And we're overharvesting, or we're removing too many species. And this is mostly happening as a result of a number of different things, but predominantly population growth. There's just so many people. and our population has been growing very, very rapidly within the last, couple hundred years. Additionally, as we have more technology, that technology requires new and additional resources, and it allows us to have more stuff. More population, we need more food, we need more land, we need more water. All of those things, when we take resources, they're not available to ecosystems. And then finally, when we've used all these resources and we throw things away, or we just create waste as a result of being living things, all of that has to go somewhere. And a lot of times that goes into our water systems or takes up space in our land, and can really harm ecosystems as well. Now, we're polluting basically every part of the earth, and we're going to look at some of these individually. So, air pollution predominantly has to do with burning fossil fuels, and coal especially is the worst. And so you've probably talked about acid rain in the past, where the burning of fossil fuels results in rainfall that can be acidic and can kill plants. Smog, when it mixes, with smoke mixes with water in the atmosphere. Probably also talked about CFCs. These are things that were in refrigerants for a long time, and they actually help destroy the ozone layer. So here, this just represents the large hole that was formed in the ozone layer as a result of CFCs, letting in a lot more UV rays that cause cancer. Fortunately, we've banned CFCs, and that hole has been shrinking. But this just goes to show what a big problem that seemingly, small amounts of chemicals can cause. As far as the water pollution is concerned, anything that lands on the land is going to end up eventually in the water. So when you use motor oil or gasoline spills or trash, all of that ends up in the water through runoff. Additionally, sediment. Industries create lots of pollutants that have to be treated, or in the past have just gone straight into our water systems. Agriculture as well. We get runoff from agricultural fields that includes manure and pesticides and fertilizers, all of which can really damage the aquatic ecosystems. On land, again, we spray a lot of pesticides all over the land and use a lot of other chemicals. We dump our trash in large holes that we call landfills. We cause a lot of erosion that basically eliminates soil from a lot of places. And all of this can result in a number of different problems, one of which is called eutrophication. And this is where, when nutrients get into water systems, they cause algae to bloom. When they die and decompose, that uses up all the oxygen and then kills all the fish. So that works something like this. So we add some nutrients, and that raises the carrying capacity of the ecosystem for the algae. So the algae population explodes, but then it runs out of food, and so it all starts to die. All the decomposers are doing cellular respiration, which means they're sucking out a lot of oxygen. And then eventually it gets so low that the fish can't breathe and they all die. Bioaccumulation is something that also can happen, and this is where toxins build up as you go up in the food chain. So here's an example of a chemical that's released into the ocean from a number of different sources. And so this chemical gets absorbed in some of the little small organisms in the aquatic environment. And then those small organisms get eaten by bigger ones. And you notice that the bigger organisms are eating a bunch of the littler organisms, so they're incorporating a lot more of this toxin. And then you get the herring, and then the salmon, and then the large mammals like orcas. And each time you're getting more and more toxin in the tissue of these organisms. And that's one of the reasons why fish like tuna are not necessarily good to eat in large amounts, because they can contain toxins like mercury and other things like these PCBs. We're also altering habitats in a number of ways. Things like clear-cutting forests for developments. This just happened right across the street from the school. We cut down a whole forest or a large area of trees in order to put some housing. Fragmentation, when we run roads and things through habitats, that often goes right in the way of where organisms have to move. Climate change, we're actually changing a lot of the climates of the ecosystems too fast for organisms to adapt, and so many of them are going to go extinct. And finally, invasive species. So this is an example of an invasive species that everyone knows. This is kudzu. And as you can see, kudzu is just growing up over top of all the native species. And it's not that kudzu is necessarily superior to these other species. It's just that everyone else has developed and evolved into balance. And so when kudzu or other invasives come in, the ecosystem's just not adapted to them. There's no natural predator for kudzu like there is in its native environment. And so there's nothing to suppress its population, and it goes wild. And then finally, we're going to look at overharvesting, which means we're just taking too many organisms. Things like poaching, overfishing, and this can result in extinction and has resulted in the extinction of many, many organisms. For example, many of your large mammals in Africa are going extinct as a result of poaching. We have fished a number of organisms almost into extinction just because of overconsumption. And so this is a big, big problem as we have more and more people.